Once, over 5,000 freight wagons rumbled through Britain's largest rail yard every single day. They were kept in motion by a workforce 2,500 strong. Now, rusting tracks sprawl across empty acres, and the traffic has collapsed by more than 60%. How did this colossal artery of British industry end up abandoned and bleeding out? And what chain of decisions sealed its fate? The full story begins where everything seemed unstoppable. Day and night, Toton Yard pulsed with movement. In the 1960s, more than 5,000 wagons rolled through its tangled web of sidings every single day. Coal from the Nottinghamshire and Yorkshire pits, iron ore from the foundries, steel bound for factories, everything passed through here, sorted and reassembled with clockwork precision. The yard never slept. Shunters, signalmen, fitters, and drivers worked in overlapping shifts, each crew handing off to the next as the sun rose and fell. Over 2,500 men and women relied on Toton for their livelihoods. The hum of diesel engines, the clang of buffers, the shouts of foremen, these sounds filled the air from dusk until dawn, forming the heartbeat of the region's industry. A former yard shunter, Jack Turner, remembers his first night shift. He describes the yard as a city unto itself, rows of wagons stretching out into the darkness, signal lamps flickering like stars, and the constant movement of locomotives nudging wagons into place. You could walk for half an hour and not reach the end of it, he recalls. Everywhere you looked, there was someone at work, grease on their hands, coal dust in their hair. We all knew our part. If you made a mistake, the whole chain would feel it. But when it all went right, you felt proud to be part of something bigger. The sense of community was everywhere. Toton's marshalling operation was a feat of coordination. Each incoming train was broken up, its wagons uncoupled, and sent rolling down the yard's humps, gravity guiding them into the correct sidings. Teams of shunters watched for hand signals. Brakesmen rode the wagons to slow them, and clerks kept detailed ledgers of every load. Steam engines gave way to diesels. But the rhythm of the work stayed the same. The yard handled more freight than any other in Britain, and for a time it seemed as if nothing could slow its momentum. On holidays and weekends, the surrounding towns of Long Eaton and Stapleford would buzz with the energy of Toton's workforce. Pubs filled with railway men swapping stories, local shops thrived on their custom, and generations grew up with the yard as a constant presence. For families, a job at Toton meant stability and pride. Children learned the names of locomotives before they could read, and the sight of a father's overalls by the door was a sign of honest work. At its height, Toton was more than a rail yard. It was the engine room of Britain's industrial heartland, a place where the nation's raw materials were gathered, sorted, and sent out to keep the factories running and the lights on. Few questioned whether the trains would keep coming. The yard's future seemed as solid as the steel rails beneath their feet. By the late 1970s, the steady rhythm of Toton's marshalling was faltering. The numbers tell the story with stark clarity. Freight traffic through the yard plummeted by more than 60%. Sidings that once overflowed with coal wagons and iron ore began to empty. The decline was sudden enough to be noticed, yet slow enough to unsettle everyone who depended on the yard's endless flow. Records from the period show entire sections of track falling silent as the volume of wagons shrank. Where thousands once arrived each day for sorting, fewer and fewer trains rolled in. The coal fields that had fed Toton for generations were closing, one after another. The introduction of containerization changed the rules. Freight now moved in sealed boxes, bypassing the need for complex shunting. Lorries took over routes once dominated by rail, offering door-to-door service that railways struggled to match. British Rail's own reports from the era chart the collapse. By the early 1980s, the yard's throughput had dropped so far that some sidings were abandoned altogether. The once essential humps, designed to send wagons rolling into precise formations, stood unused. The downside hump shunting operation ended in 1978, and the upside followed in 1984. Each closure was another step away from Toton's role as the nation's sorting house. The shrinking wagon count was not just a local problem. Across Britain, traditional marshalling yards faced the same fate, but Toton's scale made its decline impossible to ignore. A yard that had processed over 1 million wagons a year now saw only a fraction of that traffic. The sight of rusting rails and overgrown sidings became common. For railwaymen, the silence was more unnerving than the old cacophony. The figures left no doubt. Over 60% of Toton's traffic had evaporated within a decade. The collapse was not a blip or a temporary lull. It was the end of an ERA. What had seemed unshakable was now exposed as vulnerable. The foundations of Britain's rail freight system were shifting, and Toton, once the giant, was suddenly fighting for relevance. The golden age was gone, replaced by uncertainty and the creeping sense that some losses could never be reversed. In 2019, government ministers stood in front of cameras and pledged that Toton would become the beating heart of the East Midlands' future. The site was chosen as the location for the new HS2 East Midlands hub, promising not just faster trains to London, but an economic windfall. Official documents projected up to 30,000 new jobs: engineers, architects, hospitality workers, and suppliers, spreading prosperity from Long Eaton to Derby. Local leaders spoke of a once-in-a-generation chance to reverse decades of decline. Broxtowe councillors who had lobbied for the project described the mood as electric. One said they finally had a reason to believe in the future of this place again. Behind the scenes, plans took shape. The 780-acre site would become a magnet for investment, with offices, homes, and new transport links all anchored around the high-speed station. For the first time in years, there was talk of Toton as a place where young people might build careers instead of leaving for good. But in October 2023, the government scrapped the HS2 Eastern leg. The announcement landed with a thud. Promises of regeneration vanished overnight. Local councillors called it a betrayal, with one remarking that they were not just counting on a railway, they were counting on hope. The cancellation left Toton's future hanging in the balance. The land sits idle, its fate undecided. Instead of a new beginning, the community faces another chapter of waiting, as years of planning dissolve into uncertainty. Rows of tracks stretch out across Toton's 780 acres, but most are silent now, their steel rails coated in rust. Sidings that once pulsed with movement are choked with weeds and brambles, the ballast beneath them sinking into uneven ground. Control towers, once perched above the yard as command centers, stand abandoned, their windows broken and staircases crumbling. The main platforms, built to handle the weight of thousands of wagons, are cracked and overgrown, concrete flaking away with each passing season. Near the heart of the yard, signal gantries lean at odd angles, their faded paint and corroded metal bearing witness to decades of neglect. Switch levers, once gripped by shunters with oil-stained hands, now hang limp, seized in place by years of rain and frost. In the old New Bank Yard, lines of wagons sit motionless, many with missing wheels or doors hanging open, their numbers barely legible beneath layers of grime. Surveys catalog what remains: miles of disused track, dozens of derelict buildings, and entire sections of the yard fenced off for safety. The infrastructure that once powered Britain's industrial arteries now serves as a reminder of what's been lost. Every rusted bolt and shattered window tells the same story of a place built for purpose, left to wither as the world moved on. The cost of inaction is written across every surface, in the slow collapse of a giant too big to save itself. A handful of workers now patrol grounds that once required thousands. The employment rosters, once thick with names, have thinned to a few pages, where generations of shunters, fitters, and signalmen once handed down their craft. Only a skeleton crew remains, mostly tasked with basic maintenance and the occasional movement of infrastructure trains. The specialized knowledge that kept Toton running, how to read the subtle shift in a loaded wagon, how to coax a stubborn set of points, how to orchestrate the flow of hundreds of wagons without a single written word, has faded as the last veterans retire. Each departure takes with it decades of experience, stories, and the kind of practical wisdom that cannot be captured in a manual. Jack Turner, who spent 40 years on the yard, remembers the quiet pride of a job done right. He speaks of colleagues who could spot trouble in a locomotive's rhythm from 100 yards away, or sense a fault in the rails by the way a wagon jolted underfoot. You cannot train that in a classroom, he says. You learn it by doing, by working with people who have been here longer than you. Today, the new hires are few, and most come and go without ever knowing the full scope of what was lost. The tools of the trade, lanterns, levers, ledgers, gather dust in locked rooms. The skills that once defined Toton are slipping away, and with them, a living memory of Britain's industrial backbone. The yard stands not just as a monument to physical decline, but as a place where a century of railway know-how is quietly vanishing, one retirement at a time. On the high street in Long Eaton, shop windows display empty units where thriving businesses once stood. The decline of Toton Yard sent ripples far beyond the railway fences. When the yard was bustling, local shops and cafes depended on hundreds of workers coming off shift, buying bread, stopping for a pint, or picking up groceries on their way home. Now, foot traffic has thinned to a trickle. A shop owner on Derby Road describes how lunchtime crowds vanished almost overnight. She remembers, "We used to get the railway lads in every day. Now it's just the odd face." You can feel the difference in the air. Council reports show that investment has stalled across the area. Developers hesitate to commit, wary of promises that never materialize. Projects announced with fanfare, new housing, business parks, even a leisure center, remain stuck on planning boards. The 780 acres of Toton's land, once a magnet for economic optimism, now sit fenced off and overgrown. In Stapleford, community groups lobby for regeneration, but without clear backing or a timeline, hope gives way to frustration. Local leaders warn that every year of uncertainty deepens the sense of drift. The land is neither fully industrial nor ready for something new. For residents, the yard's slow fade isn't just about lost trains. It's about the gradual erosion of opportunity, the quiet closing of doors that once led to a better future. Containerization changed more than just the way goods moved. It rewrote the rules of freight economics. In the old system, yards like Toton acted as the nerve centers, breaking up and reassembling endless streams of wagons. But as the global shipping industry shifted to sealed containers and point-to-point logistics, the need for vast marshalling yards vanished almost overnight. Direct intermodal routes now link ports to distribution centers with no stops in between. Economists point out that this model slashed costs and sped up deliveries, but it also left behind the sprawling infrastructure built for a different era. The environmental cost of this shift has become impossible to ignore. Rail freight is 76% less carbon-intensive than road haulage, yet underinvestment in rail has forced more cargo onto lorries. Nonprofit campaigners warn that every container diverted from rail to road means more emissions, more congestion, and more pressure on communities already struggling with air quality. The paradox is stark. Just as the world looks for ways to cut carbon, Britain's most climate-friendly freight routes are being sidelined. The market logic of efficiency has come at a price measured in lost opportunity and rising emissions, leaving Toton as a symbol of a system that no longer matches the needs of its time. When British Rail was broken up in the 1990s, the old certainty of public stewardship gave way to a patchwork of private companies, and shifting responsibilities. A Network Rail official describes the result as fragmented accountability, with no single body willing or able to commit to large-scale freight investment. The Department for Transport, focused on passenger priorities and cost controls, left freight yards like Toton to fend for themselves. Local councils drafted ambitious plans for the 780-acre site. Proposals for new business parks, homes, and even a modern logistics hub. But without central government support or private capital, these ideas stalled at the drawing board. A logistics analyst points to the contrast across the channel. In Germany, Maschenyard outside Hamburg received billions in public and private funding to modernize as Europe's largest freight terminal. France invested heavily in hubs like Woipi, integrating rail freight into national supply chains. While Britain debated policy and trimmed budgets, European competitors built infrastructure that kept their freight networks relevant and profitable. The analyst calls it a policy gap, a failure to choose between meaningful modernization and planned withdrawal. Instead, Toton remains in limbo, too big to redevelop without help, too neglected to attract serious freight business. The result is paralysis, not progress. Without a clear strategy or leadership, the lessons from Europe remain just out of reach, and the yard's potential stays locked behind chain-link fences and rusted gates. Across 780 unused acres, Toton's silence is a warning. Britain now moves more freight by road than by rail, despite rail's 76% lower carbon footprint. Every abandoned mile here marks a choice between neglect and renewal, between short-term cuts and long-term vision. The future of national infrastructure isn't just tracks and trains, it's what kind of country we decide to build. What do you think Britain should choose next?